Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us for our February presentation in the fourth year of the speaker series, Toxicology and Society's Impacts of Chemicals in Our Lives. I'm Ruth Sofield, and I'm a professor of environmental toxicology and chemistry at Western Washington University. My co-hosts, Tracy Collier and Ian Moran, could not join us today. We would like to begin by acknowledging that we at Western Washington University are on the ancestral homelands of the Coast Salish peoples who have lived in the Salish Sea Basin throughout the San Juan Islands and the North Cascades watershed from time immemorial. Please join us in expressing our deepest respect and gratitude for our Indigenous neighbors, the Lummi Nation and Nooksack tribe, for their enduring care and protection of our shared lands and waterways. And now I'd like to go over a few logistics. We will save questions for the end of the presentation, but you can use the Q&A feature on your screen at any time. You will be muted throughout the presentation, so we will use this feature to interact. The focus of our speaker series is to provide understandable examples of how events with a toxicological component have consequences to people and societies. Today, we are delighted to welcome Ted Shetler, an MD, the director of the Science and Environmental Health Network, and the Science Advisor to Healthcare Without Harm. Today, he will present on the 2023 train derailment in East Palestine, Ohio, which released large quantities of hazardous chemicals that impacted the town's residents and their resources. Welcome, Dr. Shetler.
Thank you very much, Ruth. It's a pleasure to be here. Thanks for the opportunity to join you and to participate in this wonderful series that you've put together.
Thank you.
I'm going to share my screen here so that I can show some slides. Are you able to see that?
I can see it. It looks great.
Okay, great. So to begin, I just want to make it clear, in the interest of full disclosure, that I've never been to East Palestine, Ohio, and what I'm presenting today is gathered from a number of sources, including publicly available material on state and federal websites, conversations with journalists and scientists who have visited East Palestine since the derailment, media reports, and Zoom attendance at a community meeting last year. On occasion, the information is inconsistent, but this is what residents of East Palestine have been dealing with for the past year. Now my slides won't advance for some reason. There we go. On February 3rd last year, a train more than 1.5 miles long carrying hazardous materials derailed in East Palestine, Ohio at about 9 o'clock in the evening after an overheated wheel bearing went unnoticed until too late. In all, 38 cars derailed and an additional 12 were damaged. 20 of these cars were carrying hazardous materials. Contents of some of the cars immediately caught fire and people nearby were evacuated. But 3 days later, on February 6th, authorities extended the evacuation zone and released and burned off vinyl chloride from 5 tankers when there was growing concern that one of them might explode. And this photograph was taken on February 6th when the vinyl chloride was being burned off. And I just want to point out here, these plumes of black smoke that are coming from the vinyl chloride are creating conditions where a number of products of combustion are undoubtedly being formed. And I'll get into that a little bit later. But this is a recipe for making novel hazardous chemicals in addition to what was being burned on the ground. On February 8th, authorities announced that residents could return, saying that air quality samples in the area of the wreckage and in nearby residential neighborhoods have consistently showed readings below safety screening levels for contaminants of concern. They went on to say that for those who would like air quality readings in their homes, Norfolk Southern, which was the owner of the railroad, has hired an independent contractor called CTEH to take air quality samples and provide results at no charge to residents. Free testing of water from private wells in the impacted area will also be offered. CTH is an Arkansas-based consulting firm that responds to industry requests for help during emergencies involving hazardous materials. This is the contracting firm that also went in to investigate after the BP oil spill in the Gulf many years ago, and has responded to other industrial accidents like that at the request of the industries. For days after residents were told that there were no lingering health risks, many continued to complain of chemical odors, skin rashes, headaches, confusion, coughs, chest tightness, nausea, and occasional vomiting. So with that as background, what is it that was actually released when the train derailed? And this slide shows a list of the chemicals that were in chemicals and materials that were in the various cars that either burned or spilled with the derailment. And I'll go through these briefly, and then we'll get into a little bit more about what their implications are in a moment. But vinyl chloride was in 5 tankers, and that was the hazardous chemical that was released and burned 3 days after the derailment. Vinyl chloride, which is a plastic made out of vinyl chloride, polyvinyl chloride, was in 2 cars, and that also burned. Then there was butyl acrylate, ethyl hexyl acrylate, and ethylene glycol monobutyl ether in separate cars. They also burned or spilled. Polyethylene, a polymer plastic, and then petroleum lube oil, which spilled but did not burn. Propylene glycol spilled, and then there were cars that were carrying frozen vegetables and semolina flour that were scattered in among these chemical containing cars. Now, I mentioned the known or probable products of combustion in that plume that I showed you, and we can presume that that these were formed because the vinyl chloride was burned, and when you burn vinyl chloride, it creates phosgene gas and hydrochloric acid. When you burn vinyl chloride and polyvinyl chloride plastic, you also create dioxins and furans and other chlorinated compounds like chlorinated polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons, and I'll talk a little bit more about those in a moment. And then acrolein was detected at elevated levels by a Texas A&M group that came in a few days later at levels that were 5 to 10 times higher than levels that were detected in Pittsburgh at the same time, a number of miles away, which suggests that this was actually probably a product of combustion from the materials that were spilled and burned, and explaining why it would be present at higher levels in an otherwise somewhat rural area of Ohio. Now, on this slide, I want to show several things. I've selected 4 of the compounds here that were released, and I want to show the great variability in their odor threshold. That is the level at which a person might begin to be able to smell them in the air. And you'll see that it varies quite a bit. Butyl acrylate and ethyl hexyl acrylate have odor thresholds in the several down in the part per billion range, 0.035 parts per million, for example, for butyl acrylate, whereas vinyl chloride, which is one of the more hazardous things that was spilled and burned, has an odor threshold of 3,000 parts per million, telling us that we can't rely on our smell to begin to tell us about whether we're being exposed to a toxic compound or not. You'll also see that the volatility of these compounds varies from highly volatile to low volatility. And then I'm also showing what these chemicals are used for. Many of them are used in paints and coatings and caulks and adhesives, for example. So these are the kinds of chemicals that make up many of the coatings and paints and so forth that would be put on consumer products that are present in our homes, our offices, our schools, our businesses, and so on. Now, here I want to just briefly summarize some of the toxic impacts of these chemicals and consider who might have been exposed as we think about not only the residents, but also the respondents and the cleanup workers as they approach this disaster. Vinyl chloride at high enough levels can cause acute exposures, can cause drowsiness and headache and dizziness. Lower level exposures over a longer period of time are associated with memory loss, kidney and liver disease, and vinyl chloride is well known as a carcinogen that can cause angiosarcoma of the liver and hepatocellular carcinoma. Butyl acrylate and ethyl hexyl acrylate share some toxic properties, causing lung irritation, eye and throat irritation, headache. Butyl acrylate causes an allergic skin rash in many people. And you'll see some similar toxic effects from ethylene glycol monobutyl ether, an eye irritant, skin irritant, headache, and nausea, as well as isobutylene causing dizziness, drowsiness, skin, and eye irritation. And these are well described in the toxicological literature. With regard to the presumed products of combustion that we think were undoubtedly released during the fire, and then the response to the fire, as I mentioned, phosgene and hydrochloric acid are created when you burn vinyl chloride. These are severe lung irritants, and inhalation can cause severe lung damage. I've mentioned the dioxins and furans. These are chemicals of a family that are persistent and bioaccumulative. Unlike many of the other chemicals that were spilled, which have short half-lives, these dioxins and furans are persistent. They can get into the food chain and can create very long-term problems. At high doses, they cause a skin condition called chloracne. But at lower doses, that would undoubtedly be relevant to something like this event. They can, with chronic exposure, be carcinogenic, suppress the immune system, cause cardiovascular disease and diabetes, and have adverse reproductive effects. So if these are around, you'd like to know about it and do what you can to mitigate exposures. Acrolein, which I mentioned as another product of incomplete combustion here, is a severe lung irritant, can cause shortness of breath as well as nausea and vomiting. And then we presume that there were perfluorinated alkyl substances, or so-called persistent fire suppressants that were undoubtedly used to suppress the fire, which would be present in the environment. Some of these are carcinogens, immune suppressors, and cause thyroid dysfunction. So on this slide, I've borrowed from Dr. Andrew Welton at Purdue University, who actually did visit East Palestine with a crew of his students and other scientists on several occasions. And I just wanted to give you sort of a sense of the lay of the land here. On the bottom panel, you'll see a blue line going across the photo, and that's shows the what's called Sulphur Run or Sulphur Creek. And you'll see on the right-hand side where the derailment site is identified, and then Sulphur Creek runs from the east to the west across town, and where it joins in with the perpendicular line over there on the left lower corner, and that's Leslie Creek or Leslie Run. So this is water moving through town, and you'll see underground culverts that are marked along Leslie Run, and you'll see photographs of those in the upper panels where Sulphur Run is moving through town. And on the very top, you'll see, for example, in that upper left corner, a house not far from Sulphur Run. That house actually has a sump drain in its basement that drains directly into Sulphur Run. So that offered a pathway for volatile compounds that were coursing through that stream there to make its way into those people's houses. And it's thought that there was actually contaminated water that was pulsing through town underneath and near buildings for months, actually, after the accident. And you'll see in the very bottom center photograph where they were actually aerating those streams to try to get the volatile compounds out of it. So they were blowing this into the air which was creating more air contamination during those processes. This is a photograph that was taken in Leslie Creek, which is the one that Sulphur Creek runs into, taken 3 weeks after the derailment. When you dipped your hand in there and disturbed the sediment, you see the oily sheen came up, and this person is taking a water sample at that place. And I've seen reports that this oily sheen still develops when the sediments in these streams are disturbed now, fully a year later. So there were a number of questions and early concerns that were raised by people in the community. This is a photograph of a community meeting I attended by Zoom, but these are residents who were there trying to learn more about what happened. And the concerns had to do with the validity of the air testing and communication by the CTEH, which was the contracting firm that I mentioned that Norfolk Southern brought in to do the air testing. They went into about 500 homes in East Palestine, looking for or testing for volatile organic compounds, and they used a rather insensitive technology called photoionization detectors, which take just a snapshot of all the VOCs, total VOCs. That's what TVOC is, to get a reading, and literally reported virtually all of them at less than 0.1 part per million in the homes, which was the basis for telling people that it was safe for them to be there. It was also a lot of concern raised about mixture effects, because this wasn't a single chemical exposure, but as I've shown you, there were a number of chemicals that were spilled and burned, and creating a timeline that would vary depending on whether exposures might be by inhalation or by drinking contaminated water or other mechanisms of exposure. And then concerns about long-term health and economic impacts. And of course, there was a lot of concern about, and continues to be concerned about, potential groundwater contamination and private well safety, because although there is a municipal water supply in town, many people in the community are on their own private wells. And it raised serious concerns about whether these chemicals, many of which are mobile in water, would slowly make their way down through the soil and get into groundwater and then migrate toward private wells and maybe show up months or years later, and whether or not there would be continuous testing for that to reassure people that their drinking water was safe. This is simply a photograph of one report from one house that Dr. Andrew Welton provided in a slide to show what people were being told. And I realize you can't read these numbers, so I'll read them to you. It's blanked out just to prevent these various sections to protect the privacy of the residents. But what you'll see in the middle column, the results for all of the VOCs there in the various rooms is reported as less than 0.1 part per million. That's consistent down that entire middle column. But you will also see that the tester wrote comments at the bottom, which say, quote, strong odor, super glue, cool, fruity-like odor, unpleasant, overwhelming. The air monitoring team left within 10 minutes due to the unpleasant, overwhelming odor. So that's what the testers from CTEH wrote on this report while they were reporting volatile organic compounds at less than 0.1 part per million. Now, the community was very interested in having dioxins and furans looked for because of the concern that they would have been formed when the vinyl chloride was burned in that complex mixture. Initially, the EPA was very resistant to testing for dioxins and furans, but ultimately the community prevailed. They hired another contracting firm, which developed a contentious sampling strategy. It was not at all clear why they did what they did when they set it out to do it. They tested both surface and subsurface soils. and there was a complete lack of transparency about where the samples were to be collected and why they were chosen to be collected where they were. I've shown structures of these chemicals at the top simply to point out that on the left are the dibenzodioxins, on the right are the furans. And you'll see chlorine atoms scattered around the periphery of these molecules. And depending on the number of chlorine atoms there has a marked effect on their toxic properties. So when you test soil, for example, for dioxins and furans, you get a mixture of them. They're not all equally toxic, so that mixture has to be converted into a standardized measure so you can get a what's called a toxic equivalency, or a TEQ. That's the standard approach for evaluating the toxicity of a mixture of dioxins and furans. But instead, the EPA reported the results in a confusing way in milligrams per each congener of the dioxins and furans, which left people sort of scratching their heads about, well, what does this mean? Another group came into town, a scientist by the name of Stephen Lester, who works with and for the Center for Health, Environment, and Justice. They came into town and met with community members, and then took the EPA's dioxins and furans analysis and tried to convert it into the more standard TEQs to get some idea of what these soil levels meant. And although most of them were fairly low, you can see here on this graph that on certain days there were significantly higher levels of dioxins and furans in the soil samples that were collected on those particular days, suggesting that there are and were hotspots that needed further evaluation to see whether or not there might be places where dioxins and furans in soil needed to be remediated. Another group that came into town soon after was a group from the University of Kentucky led by Dr. Aaron Haynes, an environmental epidemiologist who quickly came in with a group and began putting together a health tracking study. They asked for volunteers from East Palestine and surrounding counties. We got several hundred people initially to join, and you'll see the numbers here. Most of them from right near East Palestine, but some also from nearby counties in Pennsylvania, as well as one county in West Virginia. This is what they reported initially from several hundred people that they joined in this survey. These are the symptoms which were new since the derailment, and you'll see that these are all consistent with exposure to the chemicals that I previously described. These are precisely the kinds of symptoms that are well described as a result of exposure to those specific chemicals. And this report comes out in August of 2023. So that's months after the derailment, and you'll see that new health symptoms are still present in about 80% of the participants in the survey. Erin Haynes and her group are continuing to do work in East Palestine with some air monitoring. They also collected some biomonitoring samples, blood and urine, and they have supplied some of the participants in their survey with wristbands, which are a way of picking up chemicals in the air as people go about their daily lives. Another group that came in to do a chemical investigation was from the Centers for Disease Control, Agency for Toxic Substance and Disease Registry. They did survey both in Ohio and Pennsylvania, so you'll see slightly different percentages depending on where the people live, but they're very similar to what Dr. Haynes and her group found in terms of the symptoms that people were complaining of. And the CDC survey also reported that 70% of respondents reported at least one new or worsening mental health symptom since the accident. And that persists as well, and it's probably understandable, but it's going to be one of the longer-term health effects. In November of last year, the National Academy of Sciences held a 2-day workshop whose purpose was to discuss strategies such as characterizing exposures, determining appropriate health surveillance, examining acute and long-term health effects, and applying insights from prior transportation disasters to aid East Palestine. And they centered the discussions on what are the various perspectives on the impact of the incident, what were the hazardous material exposures and risks, and what might be still going on. They spent time discussing risk characterization and communication and challenges and strategies for addressing and monitoring long-term impacts in this community. And here are a few highlights that I took from that workshop. Many residents, as I've shown, reported symptoms consistent with exposure to these chemicals, and clinicians were poorly trained and equipped to deal with them. And that's really not surprising because most clinicians in medical practice simply have very little training in toxicology generally, and other aspects of environmental health. And then with respect to specific chemicals, the information would be even more difficult to get or less well known. So there was clearly an ongoing need for more clinical guidance. And I think that's a take-home message to keep in mind, that we can't expect all clinicians to be up to date on the latest toxicology for every compound, but there needs to be a way for them to readily access both understanding of what the symptoms are and what to do about it. Advanced technology to identify hotspots was not readily available initially. That's clear. And then the CTEH equipment was not sensitive, and the results were misleading, as I've shown. Mixed contamination was undoubtedly pulsing through town creeks weeks after the derailment, with vapor intrusion into buildings and ongoing repetitive exposures. At the NAS workshop, there was also discussion about a considerable uncertainty about long-term health impacts and the need for a registry to monitor residents over the long term. As I pointed out, Erin Haynes' group has a voluntary survey going on with a group of residents that she's put together, but that's different from a registry where you really identify everybody who was potentially exposed and get contact information so that over time, if there are long-term impacts, you'd be able to identify them. There's need for a more coordinated communication strategy to avoid confusion and mistrust. The various agencies that were involved included the federal EPA, which has offices both in Pennsylvania, but in a different region in Ohio. So you had two different federal EPA regions involved. And then there was the Ohio State EPA, which was involved. And the communication that was coming out of these various offices was often conflicting and was very confusing, and people were just uncertain about what it all meant. Data gaps and uncertainties must be acknowledged early. People were given reassurance when it wasn't justified, and it would have been much more useful to admit what we don't know as well as what we do know, as the community members were trying to figure out what to do, where to live, whether to go to work, whether to go to school, whether they had to move. There are obvious enormous personal and community, social and economic costs, which are still ongoing, and then there needs to be more research into the vulnerabilities and effects of exposures to mixtures. Finally, I just point out that this was a preventable accident. An overheated wheel bearing was not identified at the previous town. That was later disclosed when somebody had actually video of a glowing wheel bearing. It looked like it was on fire. That was on one of the cars that, as it was leaving the previous station, and then it moved on to East Palestine. This accident has actually increased public awareness of hazardous materials that are routinely transported by rail, and it's really opened a window onto a hazardous material economy, which many people were totally unaware of. And I would point out to you that there is a Seattle-based science and advocacy organization called Toxic Free Future, and I've put their web address here on this slide, which just recently, just a week or so ago, released a lengthy analysis of just vinyl chloride that's being shipped all over the country by rail from manufacturing facilities, largely in Texas and Louisiana. And you take a look at that report, you could see that these train cars that are filled with, have a number of cars that are filled with vinyl chloride are going through populated areas really all over the country. In response to this derailment, a Railway Safety Act was introduced in Congress, but it got stalled very quickly by pushback from the rail companies who resisted it, saying that it would result in excessive regulation. Yet I would point out that there were approximately 1,000 train derailments in the United States during 2022 alone, and that number actually increased in 2023. So stay tuned. The cleanup in East Palestine continues. So far, they've removed 175,000 tons of contaminated soil, which was shipped off to a number of different states for disposal. That is now being replaced. Contaminated water is still being treated in East Palestine. And as I mentioned, the oily sheen is still present when creek sediment is disturbed. So we know that some of these chemicals are still in the community and must be dealt with. And finally, there's a group in Washington called the Government Accountability Project that is actually investigating EPA's response to the incident by using Freedom of Information Act requests and interviewing whistleblowers that have surfaced, because there's concern that the EPA was overly influenced by its interaction with the industry as they tried to mount the response initially and then in the weeks and months thereafter. So that's all I have. I'm happy to stop there and take any questions.
Thank you so much. That was super interesting. Let me fix my camera. I'm curious, just maybe as a starting point, on what led to your interest in studying this, I guess.
My organization, the Science and Environmental Health Network, often works with communities that have particular questions that come up around various aspects of environmental health. And I don't remember the exact sequence, but I was interested in this just as somebody who's interested in environmental health, and then got in contact with some folks there, and a journalist who wrote about this, Sharon Lerner, called me to talk about it as well. And she was about to make a trip to East Palestine. So then I got very interested to see what she was learning about it. So I talked with her about her trip, and she wrote a couple of articles on this accident. So I think that was all sort of what initiated this.
Okay. Well, I mean, a few things that you talked about. We have a lot of questions that came in when people registered, and we're starting to see them populate the Q&A. I also had, just listening to you, I had some thoughts and questions. And so I'm going to start with those and then kind of maybe segue into the audience and participant questions. Really curious to me that the EPA didn't start with a TEQ approach. That's so fundamental. Like, any thoughts on what was going on with that?
It's inexplicable to me. I went to the EPA website. You know, they have a website for this East Palestine disaster. So I went to it as recently as a week or so ago, and they still didn't have TEQs there. And they're reporting them in milligrams per kilo or micrograms per kilo or something of soil. And I don't understand it.
Oh, do you know which what part of EPA responded and was? No,
I don't. I assume it was from the Ohio region EPA, but I don't know that, because right next door is Pennsylvania, and there are different regions. There's Region 3 and Region 5. So Uh, I don't know the answer to that.
That's so interesting. Okay. Also curious, I mean, thoughts on CTEH as a consultant that was chosen to respond did do they have background in this kind of thing, or was it like
If you go to their website, they're staffed with highly trained toxicologists. But if you also go there, and it's very clear that CTEH is an emergency response for industry.
okay.
That's who they are. They're called in when an industry is threatened by an accident or some sort of incident that could have enormous financial implications, where hazardous chemicals are involved. They're a go-to consulting firm for industry, and uh, you know, I know that the response to the BP oil spill was not adequate, and I heard that they were the ones that went because they reassured people that all of those oil dispersants that were used in the Gulf at the time of the BP oil spill were entirely safe and so forth. And we now learn years later that a lot of them volatilized and went far inland, far away from the shore. And National Institute for Environmental Health Sciences has had an ongoing study of the long-term health effects of exposure to those oil dispersants that were used at the time of the BP oil spill. I was interested in what CTEH was using for the testing of the homes. And there were these photoionization detectors, and it turns out that those are not supposed to be used for this kind of screening. They're not sensitive for this kind of thing. They weren't those instruments, for example, could not pick up butyl acrylate at levels that begin to cause symptoms. And I think that's probably why that one report that I showed you, where even the testers left the home because the smell was so overpowering, yet they were getting these readings of less than 0.1 parts per million of total VOCs. I think it was probably the butyl acrylate there that was, because it has such a low threshold of odor threshold. But anyway, so those are just my thoughts about that.
Yeah. I mean, this, as you talked about other examples too, like the BP spill in the Gulf of Mexico, and I just kind of bring my own like personal history into this. And as you and I talked about before we started the presentation, I grew up in rural West Virginia in a small town that had a railroad running right through it. And it was a big part of our lives. I mean, we played on it. We knew the people who ran the trains. And I just like, it's really, it's hard to think about the fact that we're taking communities of people, and not just around rail, but all these examples of where we've exposed communities to substances, and like it feels like they're kind of left to just deal with it. And I'm kind of like, I don't know if you have thoughts on that, but I'm also curious if we then fast forward, I have this, professional expertise in toxicology, and I think, okay, well, we should be able to deal with this. But I also know that people who study and practice toxicology, there aren't that many of us really. And so thinking about how, going back to your comment about the clinicians and them not being trained and having access, like what are ways that we can do better in all of this?
A couple of things came up in the National Academy's workshop. There are centers around the country where there are people who are well trained that are available to clinicians. In this particular case, it's at the University of Cincinnati. There's a children's environmental health center there, and they when they were contacted, they began putting together fact sheets to distribute to clinicians to give them some guidance about what to do, because patients were coming in with rashes, and with coughs and with confusion and clinicians. And then they were, of course, asking, is this related to the derailment? And and the best many of the clinicians could do is say, well, it's quite possible or probable, but what we have to do is treat the symptoms here. I mean, if somebody's wheezing, you can treat their wheezing, but um, they need some guidance on a sort of an urgent basis. And so there need to be ways to have sort of a rapid response from people who are well trained to give guidance in a local circumstances, depending on the nature of the accident.
Do you think, I mean, has this raised enough awareness that there's going to be change around that sort of thing, or?
I don't know the answer to that. I would hope so. That National Academy's workshop is still fairly recent. It was just in November.
Yeah.
And
Right.
and hopefully the Centers for Disease Control and maybe NIEHS would take some of those recommendations and turn them into action.
One more of my questions, and then I'm gonna do some others. The number you gave on 1,000 derailments in 2022, and then an increased number in 2023. I'm curious why we don't hear more about that, and that kind of, you know, one reason could be that there aren't hazardous chemicals on them. So I'm curious why we don't hear more, and then also if you have a sense of how much of our rail traffic is there a percentage of cars or of trips or something where there's hazardous chemicals that are being transported? Is there any way to get a sense of that?
To the first question, I think one reason we probably don't hear much more about it is because many of these derailments happen in rail yards.
Right.
So they're not right in somebody's backyard in a community. Or if they happen in a rural area, there's a derailment, and then you know the railroad responds, and it's just not noteworthy or newsworthy. But there is a lot of hazardous material that's being transported by rail. It's rail and truck are the main ways that we move a lot of hazardous material around the country, and a lot is being transported by rail. And when one of these accidents occurs, uh, uh, in near a populated area, it gets a lot of attention. That report that I mentioned from Toxic Free Future, the Seattle-based group, has some really interesting data in there about where the derailments occur. And there's another group that co-authored that report called Material Research, which has a really interesting website. And Material Research does what they largely do is an analysis of the movement of hazardous material, hazardous chemicals around the country. They actually do it in other countries as well. But on their website, they have some really interesting information about the volumes of hazardous chemicals that are being transported around the country. So you can find stuff there at Material Research.
Okay, great. And we will provide a link to that to our
Good.
registered guests
Yeah.
In a follow-up email. There is, I mean, we may have already talked about this, but I think it's a good just maybe follow on just for us to close the loop on this. There's a question from one of the audience members. The observation that clinicians were not sufficiently trained is the same complaint in the aftermath of the Union Carbide Opal incident in the 1980s. Even though these incidents occurred in separate countries, this seems to be a common issue. And why haven't we seen improvements in toxicology training? And I think that's a good question for you because you have a medical degree. So you have that perspective of how y'all are trained and practice, and we're coming at it from this direction. So I'm kind of curious what your like.
Yeah, well, you know, I do have I do have a medical degree, and I got virtually no training in toxicology or environmental health when I was in medical school. So I actually went back to get further training and got a master's in public health with an emphasis in environmental health and toxicology and so on. And since then, there have been a number of surveys done showing that that clinicians generally in medicine to some degree in nursing as well, um, just do not have much systematic training in any aspect of environmental health, including toxicology. It's changed a little bit. I mean, for example, pediatricians often now learn about, things like lead poisoning, of course, and other hazardous materials that might be encountered in the homes. And so are somewhat better trained to deal with it than they have been in years past. But it's a real deficiency in medical training that I think is pretty well recognized.
Right. We have a technical question. Are you able to comment on the decision to burn the vinyl chloride? As I understand, there were multiple factors contributing to that decision, including things like atmospheric conversion, worry about ecological impacts, train car explosion, et cetera. Is there a way to evaluate if that was the right course of action?
Yeah, that's a great question, and I'll address it as best I can. First of all, I have not been able to determine exactly who gave the order to burn because there are conflicting reports.
Okay.
And obviously somebody made the decision, but I think it was actually in all likelihood, it was the railroad decided and not. But the decision was based on the following. There was concern that in at least one of the 5 tanker cars that contained vinyl chloride, that it was beginning to self-polymerize, meaning that vinyl chloride is compressed into a liquid for transport. That's it. So it's loaded under pressure in those tank cars as a liquid. Um, it was concerned that it was beginning to self-polymerize, meaning it was beginning to turn itself from vinyl chloride into polyvinyl chloride. And that's an exothermic reaction, meaning it gives off heat. And they recognized that the temperature in the car was beginning to rise. And that was the concern, that it was beginning to self-polymerize. And those tank cars, as I understand it, are equipped with a pressure relief valve so that if the pressure starts going up, they will vent to prevent an explosion. But apparently the pressure relief valve wasn't working on at least one of the cars. And so now they were confronted with the problem of a tank car that may be self-polymerizing, the temperature is going up, it's not venting, there's going to be an explosion. And so then a decision was made, well, let's burn it all. So they dug trenches. And when you release the vinyl chloride from pressure, it converts from a liquid to a gas, which is heavier than air, collects in the trenches, and that's where they set the fire to burn it. So that's my best understanding of the sequence of events that led to the incineration of those cars.
Right. Okay. Okay. How about responsibility? So there's a couple of questions about the responsibility of the liable party, but also who should be holding the railroad responsible. So could you talk about that a little bit? How much, like what has happened to the liable party, what's likely to happen, or what is
Yeah, well, Norfolk Southern is clearly responsible. And it's my understanding that they've accepted full responsibility. And they've spent hundreds of millions of dollars in cleanup so far. I mean, they've been, that all that soil that was carted away and all that, as well as the testing and so on, that's all the responsibility of Norfolk Southern. This cost them a lot of money. They say they're in it for the long haul. They're putting money into other community activities as well. So I don't think there's any question about who's responsible, I guess. But when it gets down to the individual level, just to give you some examples. So people were moved out of town that were in the evacuation zone or who felt that they were sick, moved out of town, given temporary housing in certain places. I mean, there were people who were moved into Pennsylvania and went to motels and lived for months. Um, and But now all of a sudden Norfolk Southern says, okay, everything's clean enough for you to come home and we're not going to pay for your motel anymore. But when I come home, a person says, I immediately start to feel sick again. So there are those individual examples of where there are conflicts that need to be resolved, but ultimately Norfolk Southern is responsible for this, and I don't think they've denied that.
And they're being held accountable at the federal or the state level or all
Well,
levels?
I think it's federal. I think
Federal.
it's federal
Because
because
interstate.
yeah, interstate Department of Transportation. Yeah.
Okay. Okay. Okay, there's a question about East Palestine health effects study at UC San Diego. Are you aware of that one or?
At UC San Diego, no, I'm
Yeah.
not.
Okay, so I won't ask that question, but there's a question about that. I'm also curious, and there's some questions about this. Well, let's do this one. This one. Do you know the rationale for the daily repeated sampling of soil? Like that kind of seemed odd to me. And like I can imagine those spikes weren't because there was a change in time, but just as you said,
Those were different days,
yeah,
different days on different places. So they set out a sampling strategy, but it wasn't, as far as I understand it, the typical way of assessing a site for dioxin furans is to lay out a grid.
right.
And then you methodically go through the grid and collect samples. They, according to all the reports I saw, said that they were going to choose the site where they did the sampling based on whether or not there was presence of ash on the surface, meaning that it's a place that may have been impacted. But this was weeks after the accident, when there would have been rainfall and so on, where ash would have been washed all over the place. It was not a systematic grid sampling of an area. And then they did sampling in certain places one day, and then another day was someplace else. So that graph I was trying to just simply show that in some places on certain days there were much higher levels than in others.
Yeah. Okay. How about impacts to wildlife, aquatic life? I also uh, agriculture, those sorts of.
Yeah, I should have mentioned this, but initially, almost on day one, there was a huge fish kill in those streams, and there were photos of just small dead fish floating on the surface. Probably due to the butyl acrylate. It's a very potent aquatic toxicant. So that's my guess as to what caused it. Um, I I I read reports of other wildlife well downstream of people finding dead wildlife. Uh, I don't know that I at least haven't seen anything systematic about that. I mean, to the extent to which finding a carcass of wildlife could be attributable to this or not. But the aquatic toxicity was very clearly demonstrated. People have been concerned about agriculture. That was one of the reasons why the dioxin furan testing was insisted on, because there's a lot of there are a lot of agricultural there are farms around with cattle and chickens and so on. And if this was now going to get into the food supply, into the food chain, um, people's agricultural livelihoods would be upset. So far, I've not seen any any reports of contaminated milk coming from farms or contaminated eggs, but that's exactly why people wanted the soil testing. They wanted to know, is it safe for us to plant our crops this year? That would have been last summer. And as far as I know, uh, uh, people did, but there was real concern about it.
Right. I'm going to close with two more questions. One is kind of related to um, the more mental aspects and
Yeah.
the also economic aspects, like kind of lumping those together, the things that we don't traditionally think of with a
Mhm.
toxic exposure, like the things that are real for people, like that are also like in addition to any sort of health effects, um, I guess mental health. But like, can you kind of comment, like, have property values changed? What is like, there's fear, like
Yeah.
what are
Yeah.
the
There are
economic
people,
implications?
people would like, some people would like to move and they can't sell their house. Uh, people are really concerned about long-term viability as a community. So there has been there's a lot of resurgence of people trying to do more community activism to sort of let's not let East Palestine die. But yeah, depression, anxiety, uh, uh, and various behaviors that come along with that are a real concern. The Centers for Disease Control and EPA have made certain that there are clinics available for residents who have whether they're the concerns of breathlessness or as well as mental health as a very big part of this, because with both the mental health concerns, but also the economic uncertainties is just creating its own stress in this community. And people who say, I expected to live my entire life here, raise my family here. Now here, my 5-year-old never had asthma before, and now wheezes. And should I stay? Should I go? These are all very, very tough questions. Erin Haynes and her group from the University of Kentucky have tried to make it clear that we're not going away. We're going to be back. We're not just in here as scientists who drop in by parachute, take some blood samples, and go home. But we'll be back, and we're trying to follow them over time, and we'll see what the Centers for Disease Control do. But they've pointed out that the mental health stuff persists long after the accident.
Yeah, that's the kind of thing that is so important for us to think about. Kind of closing question, as you and I talked about, I'm in Bellingham, and we have a rail corridor right here that's a very prominent part of our community. And I'm sure people from other parts of the country that are on here also may have similar experiences. And so I'm just curious, what can we do? What should we do if we're in a community with a rail line that goes through it? Like, what are kind of some...
I think it would be useful to get some sense of what's being transported through town. I don't know in Bellingham, but it would probably be not too hard to find out. Or if it's hidden and not well known, it ought to be transparent, because people ought to be prepared. I mean, not only residents, but first responders, people in the fire department, in the emergency departments, people in the healthcare system ought to be. There ought to be a transparent, rapid way of communicating if there is a derailment in Bellingham or any other town. What is there, and how do we find out what's there? What got spilled? What got burned? So that the manifests on these rail cars are rapidly available. So first responders know. I mean, if you think about it, if you're going into a building fire as a fireman, you better know what's burning, because it influences the way you fight the fire. And we could say the same thing for a train derailment. If you don't know what got spilled or what's burning, you're sort of behind the 8 ball in terms of figuring out how to respond, and what are the immediate risks, what are the next level of risk, and so on. So I think that came out in the National Academy's workshop as well, the importance of transparency and communication about what's being moved around.
Yeah. Well, I could talk to you for hours. Super fascinating. We really appreciate you being part of our series, and I just want to thank you. And
well, my pleasure. Thank you very much for the
Yeah.
opportunity to join you. I appreciate it.
Thank you so much.
Bye-bye.
Bye.